Modern history has been shaped by conquest. The conquest of the world by Europeans. The conquistadors led the way. A few hundred men who came to the New World and decimated the native population. The secret of their success? Guns, germs, and steel. Ever since, people of European origin have dominated the globe with the same combination of military power, lethal microbes, and advanced technology. But how did they develop these advantages in the first place? Why did the world ever become so unequal? These are questions that Professor Jared Diamond has spent more than 30 years trying to answer. One of the most original thinkers of our age, Diamond has traveled the world looking for clues. He set himself a daunting task: to peel back the layers of the past and explore the very roots of power in the modern world.
Whatever I work on for the rest of my life, I can never work on questions as fascinating as the questions of guns, germs, and steel, because they're the biggest questions of human history.
What separates the haves from the have-nots? How have guns, germs, and steel shaped the history of the world? Jared Diamond's quest to uncover the roots of inequality began in the rainforests of Papua New Guinea.
Oh, you look up. Oh.
Diamond is a professor at UCLA in Los Angeles. He's a biologist by training, a specialist in human physiology. But his real passion has always been the study of birds.
I love watching birds in this place. I began watching birds when I was 7 years old in the United States. Then it was just a matter of identifying them. I came here when I was 26 years old to New Guinea, and it was love at first sight. Look.
Diamond has been making regular trips to New Guinea ever since.
Why squirty?
And is now a leading expert on the bird life of the island.
Morning, Wontok.
But in the course of his field work, he's become just as curious about the people of New Guinea.
You go find a fish. 20 fish you got? That's old number 2 bush power cry going. Over the years, I've gotten to know and like thousands of New Guineans. The name belong again, you talk? Name Yanai. I've learned several of their languages, and much of what I know about birds I picked up from them.
Because of hard work.
There have been people living in New Guinea for at least 40,000 years. Much longer than on the continents of North and South America. Look 'em. Look 'em, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pella. They're among the most culturally diverse and adaptable people in the world. So why are they so much poorer than modern Americans?
The question was put to Diamond bluntly by a man called Yali, whom he met on a beach more than 30 years ago.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
Yali's question really threw me. It seemed so simple and obvious, and I thought it must have a simple and obvious answer. But when he asked me, I had no idea what that answer was.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
New Guineans use the word cargo to describe the material goods first brought to their country by Westerners. Cargo was regarded by many as evidence of the white man's power. It was treated with an almost religious reverence. For their part, Western colonials typically believed that power was determined by race. They saw themselves as genetically superior to the native population. To them, it was only natural that they should have so much cargo, and New Guineans so little.
To me, any explanation based on race is absurd. I know too many really smart New Guineans to believe there's anything genetically inferior about them. It's their ingenuity and their quickness to learn that have always impressed me. They can go empty-handed into some of the most difficult environments on Earth, knock up a shelter in a few hours and survive. Me try and dispel a step. Dispel a rope be strong and up and up and up and up. I wouldn't know where to start. In this environment, I'd be helpless without them. So why didn't these ingenious people invent metal tools, or build great cities, or develop any of the other trappings of modern civilization? The world that I'm from is so different. The modern U.S. is the richest, most powerful state on Earth. It's crammed with more cargo than most New Guineans could ever imagine. But why? That's what Yali wanted to know. How did our worlds ever become so different?
Diamond realized that Yali's question was far bigger and more complex than it first appeared. It was really about the roots of inequality. A question as old as human history itself.
Why, since ancient times, have some societies progressed faster than others? What allowed the Egyptians to build great pyramids while most of the world was still scratching out a living? How did the Greeks ever develop such an advanced civilization? Or the Romans? Or the Maya? All great civilizations have had some things in common: advanced technology, large populations, and a well-organized workforce. If I could understand how those things came into existence, then I'd understand why some people marched faster than others during the course of history.
Diamond set out to explore the division of the world into haves and have-nots. It was a massive challenge that few scholars would have dared take on. He was a scientist, not a historian. How could he possibly solve the great puzzles of human history? To understand where inequality came from, Diamond needed to identify a time before inequality, when people across the world were living more or less the same way. He had to turn back the clock thousands of years, back before the first civilizations, back into prehistory. "13,000 years ago, the ravages of the last ice age were over. The world was becoming warmer and wetter. One area where humans were thriving was the Middle East. "13,000 years ago, the Middle East was far less arid than today, with more forests, trees, and plants. People here lived like people everywhere at this time, as hunter-gatherers in small, mobile groups. They were frequently on the move, making shelters wherever they could find animals to hunt or plants to gather. They'd live in these shelters for weeks or months at a time, as long as they could keep feeding themselves. But as seasons changed and animals migrated, they'd move on to the next valley or ridge looking for new sources of food. One of the few places on Earth where it's still possible to find people hunting and gathering is the rainforest of Papua New Guinea.
Instead of just reading about this lifestyle in archaeological books, I've been lucky enough to witness it firsthand, to see for myself how we all lived 13,000 years ago, and how we found food. To catch an animal requires skill, stealth, and encyclopedic knowledge about hundreds of animal species. You have to be pretty smart to be a hunter.
"13,000 years ago, people in the Middle East hunted in the same way, tracking down whatever game they could find. But the fundamental problem with hunting is that it's never been a productive way to find enough food. It takes time to track each animal. And with a bow and arrow, there's no certainty of how the hunt will end.
One of something. You know can lap. You try and get.
Okay. Pull him. Okay.
One time more.
Yes.
One
So
time
you
more.
pull him strong.
Ni pull him strong. Yeah, me.
Yeah, you pull him strong and by go more yet.
Me play broken bowl
No,
on you.
but you not strong. You not strong, yeah.
Me no strong. What of
So
something?
you pull him strong.
All right, me pull him strong. Me fight him one fella divide. Divide, die finish. You number one, me number two. Me try, me go.
Because hunting is so unpredictable, traditional societies have usually relied more on gathering. In this part of Papua New Guinea, the gathering is done by women. An important source of food here is wild sago. By stripping a sago tree, they can get to the pulp at the center, which can be turned into a dough and then cooked. Although it's physically harder work, gathering is generally a more productive way of finding food than hunting. But it still doesn't provide enough calories to support a large population.
This jungle around us, you might think it's a cornucopia, but it isn't. Most of these trees in the jungle don't give us anything edible. There are just a few sago trees, and the rest of these trees don't yield anything that we could eat. And then sago itself has got limitations. One tree yields only maybe about 70 pounds of sago. It takes them 3 or 4 days to process that tree. So it's a lot of work really for not a great deal of food. Plus the sago starch is low on protein. And also the sago can't be stored for a long time. And that's why hunter-gatherer populations are so sparse. If you want to feed a lot of people, you got to find a different food supply. You got to find a really productive environment, and it's not going to be a sago swamp.
In the Middle East, there were very different plants to gather. Growing wild between the trees were 2 cereal grasses, barley and wheat. Far more plentiful and nutritious than sago. These simple grasses would have a profound impact, setting humanity on a course towards modern civilization. But it would take a catastrophic change in the climate before this would happen. 12,500 years ago, the world's climate became highly volatile. The long-term thaw that had brought about the end of the last ice age suddenly went into reverse. Global temperatures dropped and ice age conditions returned. The world became colder and drier. The Middle East suffered an environmental collapse. Animal herds died off. So did many trees and plants. The drought lasted for more than 1,000 years. People were forced to travel farther and look much harder to find any source of food. But despite the conditions, they would somehow survive and even prosper. Here in the Middle East, a new way of life would come into being, one that would change the face of the earth. Ian Kite is a Canadian archaeologist who specializes in the Stone Age history of the Middle East. His work is focused on a site in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, a place known as Dra. Kite is a co-director of the dig and works with an international team of archaeologists. They've uncovered the remains of ancient dwellings that were clearly more sophisticated than any hunter-gatherer shelters.
This is an exponent here. Those were never really exposed all the way around.
They believe this was a small village, one of the earliest permanent villages anywhere in the world. People were starting to put down roots.
What we would have had was this village of, I don't know, 40 to 50 people living in the same place. We would have had a series of oval huts that would have been partially cut into the ground. And these would have been very much the first time people settled down and lived in communities in a really extensive way.
When they radiocarbon dated the site, they discovered that the village first emerged 11,500 years ago, at the same time as the end of the drought in the Middle East. But how was it possible to feed an entire village if times were so hard? After 4 years of digging at Dra, the archaeologists believe they have an answer. It lies in this unique structure.
What you can see here is the outline of a mud wall coming all the way around here. And on the inside we have a series of upright stones that have been chipped in such a way where you can see a notch on them. And there would have been a series of beams over top of that with a floor across it. And basically you would have had a dry, humidity-controlled environment where they could take grain, they could take any plants, they could dry them out, put them in here, protect them from insects, protect them from moisture, protect them from water percolating through. What that ends up being, from our perspective, is probably the world's first granary in some form, a place where they're able to store food in a particular location on a year-round basis.
The team at DRA believes the granary was an oval-shaped mud wall building at the center of the village, a place where grain could be stored collectively. And the grains that were being stored were primarily wheat and barley. While other plants were no longer available, these cereal grasses were hardy enough to survive and durable enough to be stored for years. But if this was a time of scarcity, how was there enough grain to fill a granary? The answer suggests a radical shift in human behavior. At some point during the drought in the Middle East, people started growing their own food. Unable to maintain a mobile way of life, they would have stayed close to any source of water they could find and planted new fields of wheat and barley around them.
Rather than just following food sources around different locations, for the first time what people start to do is that they bring these resources back to them. Not just as harvested food, but they're bringing them as seeds. And they're growing them next to their village. And that's the first time, really, this is the first time we see this anywhere in the world.
The Stone Age people of the Middle East were becoming farmers, the first farmers in the world. Without realizing it, these new farmers were changing the very nature of the crops around them. With every round of planting and harvesting, they'd favor ears of wheat and barley whose seeds were the biggest, tastiest, or easiest to harvest. Traits that were useless to the plant in the wild thrived under human cultivation.
They interrupted the cycle. They interrupted the normal environmental cycle and started to select these individual plants and basically rewarding those that were going to be most profitable to them. And so even though it was accidental, once that whole process started, people are starting to control nature.
The way crops are changed by human interference is known as domestication. Today it happens in research labs, with scientists selecting genes and breeding crops to be ever more useful to humans. It's a very precise, deliberate process, but not so different from what the first farmers were doing unconsciously thousands of years ago in the Middle East.
The transition to farming was clearly a decisive turning point in human history. People who remained hunter-gatherers couldn't produce anywhere near as much food as farmers, and also couldn't produce much food that could be stored. They were always going to be at a chronic disadvantage. Now I needed to know where else in the ancient world people had become farmers. If I could establish links between the spread of farming and the spread of civilization, I'd be well on my way to answering Yali's question.
There are only a few parts of the ancient world that developed farming independently. Not long after the Middle East came China, where people grew another high-yield cereal grass, rice. Pockets of farming also emerged in the Americas, based on corn, squash, and beans. Later in Africa, people farmed sorghum, millet, and yams. And in most places where farming emerged, a relatively large advanced civilization followed. But there was an exception to the rule, an area where farming didn't bring the same benefits: the highlands of New Guinea. For 50 years after Westerners colonized New Guinea, they thought the highland valleys in the interior were uninhabited. In fact, they were the most densely populated part of the island, with one of the oldest systems of farming in the world. Archaeologists now believe that people have been farming here for almost 10,000 years, almost as long as the people of the Middle East.
It's amazing to think that these people, Yali's people, were some of the earliest farmers in the world. But if they were farmers, why weren't they propelled down the same path towards civilization as the people of the Middle East or China or Central America? Why didn't they end up producing their own cargo? New Guinea farmers themselves were surely no less talented than farmers anywhere else in the world. So, what was the difference? Highland agriculture was based on crops like these taro roots, which are very different from cereal crops. Taro is much more work. You got to plant it one by one, unlike wheat where you throw your hand and spread the seed. And these New Guinea crops can't be stored for years the way wheat can. They rot quickly. They have to be eaten in a short time. They're also low in protein compared to wheat, so these farmers of the New Guinea highlands suffered from protein deficiency. There's not much protein to be gotten from New Guinea's other crops either. People here farm local varieties of bananas. But although bananas are rich in sugar and starch, like taro, they're low in protein. In fact, people in the highlands have so little protein that sometimes they eat giant spiders to supplement their diet. I'd reached a moment of realization. Farming was clearly crucial to the story of human inequality. But just as important was the type of farming. People around the world who had access to the most productive crops became the most productive farmers. Ultimately, it came down to geographic luck.
It's an audacious idea that the inequalities of the world were born from the crops we eat. According to Jared Diamond, Americans have had an advantage over New Guineans because for centuries they've grown crops that are more nutritious and productive. Crops like wheat, which provides about a fifth of all the calories they eat. The wealth of modern America could never have been sustained by taro and bananas. But Diamond's idea seems almost too simple. Could plants alone really have the power to shape the course of human history? Or was there something else at play? Another reason for the division of the world into haves and have-nots. By 9,000 years ago, the first settlements in the Middle East were giving way to much larger villages. People were only able to live on this scale by becoming more productive farmers. They were surrounded by fields of domesticated wheat and barley. But by now, they also had another steady source of food.
What we see happening about 9,000 years ago is a remarkable transformation in the way that humans are interacting with animals. We begin to see a process of animal domestication, by which we mean humans were controlling where they were moving, they were controlling their feeding, and they were controlling their breeding. Instead of having to go out to hunt, you have a dependable meat supply on the hoof year-round around your site, rather than being subject to seasonal variations in wild game.
As well as meat, animals could be used for their milk, providing an ongoing source of protein. Their hair and skins could be used to make clothes for extra warmth. Over time, domestic animals became an integral part of the new agricultural way of life.
We know that the communities which first started to have domestic animals already had cereal crops, so they were cultivators. And the combination of these particular animals and the plants becomes an extremely attractive package in that they're complementary. After the harvest period, animals could be turned out on the stubble and they can actually eat the remains of the cereal crop harvest. In their turn, animal dung can be used to provide sort of a fertilizer for the cereal crops as well, for crops. So the whole package, is seen to be mutually beneficial, both for the animals and the plants, and of course for the humans.
Goats and sheep were the first animals to be domesticated in the ancient world, and were eventually followed by the other big farm animals of today. All of them were used at first for their meat, but they all proved useful in other ways, especially with the invention of the plow. Before the Industrial Revolution, beasts of burden were the most powerful machines on the planet. A horse or an ox harnessed to a plow could transform the productivity of the land, allowing farmers to grow more food and feed more people. In New Guinea and many other parts of the world, people never used plows because they never had the animals to pull them.
The only big domestic animal in New Guinea was the pig, and wasn't even native. It came in from Asia a few thousand years ago. While Europe and Asia had not only pigs, but also cows, sheep, goats, horses, buffalo, camels, and so on. Now, pigs do give you meat, but pigs don't give you the other products that you get from those European nation animals. Pigs don't give you milk or wool or leather or hides. And most important of all, pigs can't be used for muscle power. Pigs don't pull plows or pull carts. The only muscle power in New Guinea was human muscle power. Even today, there are no beasts of burden in New Guinea, and almost all of the farm work is still done by hand. But if farm animals were so useful, why didn't New Guineans domesticate any of their own? I decided to add up all the animals in the world that have ever been domesticated. And I was amazed by what I found.
There are nearly 2 million known species of wild animals, but the vast majority have never been farmed. Most insects and rodents are of no practical use to humans and not worth the effort of farming. Some birds, fish, and reptiles have been domesticated, but most are simply impractical to farm. So are most carnivores, not because they're dangerous, but because you'd have to grow other animals just to feed them. The best animals to farm are large, plant-eating mammals. And over the years, humans have probably tried to domesticate all of them, usually without success. Despite repeated efforts, Africans have never domesticated the elephant. In South Asia, some elephants are used as work animals, but they're not farmed for the purpose. Instead, each elephant is caught in the wild and then tamed and trained. It doesn't make economic sense to farm an animal that takes some 15 years to mature and reach an age where it can start reproducing.
Animals which make suitable candidates for domestication can start giving birth in their first or second years. They will have 1 or maybe 2 offspring a year, so their productivity is actually high. Behaviorally, they need to be social animals, meaning that the males and the females and the young all live together as a group, and they also have an internal social hierarchy, which means that if humans can control the leader, then they will also gain control over a whole herd or whole flock.
There's another crucial requirement for a domestic animal. It needs to get along with humans. Some animals don't have the temperament to live on a farm. A zebra could be an ideal domestic animal, potentially as useful as a horse. But evolving in the midst of Africa's great predators, zebras have become flighty, nervous creatures. They have a vicious streak that humans have been unable to tame. That may be why zebras have never been harnessed to a plow or ridden into battle.
I counted up 148 different species of wild, plant-eating, terrestrial mammals that weigh over 100 pounds. But of those 148, the number that have ever been successfully farmed for any length of time is just 14. Goats, sheep, pigs, cows, horses, donkeys, Bactrian camels, Arabian camels, water buffalo, llamas, reindeer, yaks, mithans, and bali cattle. Just 14 large domestic animals in 10,000 years of domestication. And where did the ancestors of these animals come from? None was from New Guinea, or Australia, or sub-Saharan Africa, or the whole continent of North America. South America had the ancestor of just one large domestic animal, the llama. The other 13 were all from Asia, North Africa, and Europe. And of these, the big 4 livestock animals, cows, pigs, sheep, and goats, were native to the Middle East. The very same area that was home to some of the best crops in the world was also home to some of the best animals. Little wonder that this area became known as the Fertile Crescent.
The people of the Fertile Crescent were geographically blessed, with access to some of the best crops and farm animals in the ancient world. It gave them a huge head start. What had begun with the sowing of wheat and the penning of goats was leading towards the first human civilization. The archaeological site of Guer in southern Jordan is 9,000 years old. But it has all the hallmarks of a town. A few hundred people lived here in rows of houses that were a wonder of technology.
Every time I come here, I'm amazed by what those people were doing. Some of the houses have a kind of air conditioning. This window here is to control the air coming from the street inside the house. And the houses, the walls and the floors of the houses from the inside at least were covered with plaster. So people were moving to a concept of homes. It's not a place just to sleep, it is a proper home, and people started to decorate the houses from the inside. And people were started to invest in their homes, because if we are talking about plaster, it is time consuming, it's effort consuming, it's very expensive to have plastered house.
As villages grew bigger, there were more people to work on the land. More people could produce more food more efficiently, enough to support specialists within the community. Freed from the burden of farming, some people were able to develop new skills and new technologies. Making plaster from limestone was a major technological breakthrough. The stones had to be heated for days at a time, at a temperature of 1,000 degrees. It may seem insignificant today, but understanding how to work with fire was the first step towards forging steel, a technology that would transform the world. By contrast, places like New Guinea never developed advanced technology. Even today, some people in the highlands are working in ways that have barely changed for centuries.
When I first came to New Guinea in the 1960s, people were still using stone tools like this axe in parts of the island. And before European arrival, people were using stone tools everywhere in New Guinea. So why didn't New Guinea develop metal tools by itself? And eventually I realized that to have metalworking specialists who can figure out how to smelt copper and iron requires that the rest of the people in the society who are farmers be able to generate enough food surpluses to feed them. But New Guinea agriculture was not productive enough to generate those food surpluses. And the result was no specialists, no metal workers, no metal tools.
The way of life in New Guinea was perfectly viable. It had survived intact for thousands of years. But according to Diamond, people didn't advance technologically because they spent too much time and energy feeding themselves. And then Westerners arrived and used their technology to colonize the country. Yet for all its advantages, the Fertile Crescent is not the powerhouse of the modern world, nor is it the breadbasket it once was. How did it lose its head start? Within 1,000 years of their emergence, most of the new villages of the Fertile Crescent were abandoned. Ironically, the region had a fundamental weakness. Despite having some of the most nutritious crops on the planet, its climate was too dry and its ecology too fragile to support continuous intensive farming.
People were destroying the environment. The waters had been overexploited, the trees had been cut, and this is what, when you face a dead end. I mean, you are facing a wall. You will end with landscape like that. I mean, with few trees, with no grass, and with less water. So what we are looking at today is the outcome of overexploiting the environment.
Unable to farm their land, entire communities were forced to move on. The advantages they'd accrued from centuries of domestication might have been lost. But again, geography was on their side.
The Fertile Crescent is in the middle of a huge landmass, Eurasia. There were plenty of places for farming to spread. And crucially, many of those places were to the east and west of the Fertile Crescent at roughly the same line of latitude. Why is that so important? Because any 2 points of the globe that share the same latitude automatically share the same length of day, and they often share a similar climate and vegetation. Crops or animals domesticated in the Fertile Crescent were able to prosper at other places along the east-west axis of Eurasia. Wheat and barley, sheep and goats, cows and pigs all spread from the Fertile Crescent, east towards India and west towards North Africa and Europe. Wherever they went, they transformed human societies.
Once the crops and animals of the Fertile Crescent reached Egypt, they caused an explosion of civilization. Suddenly, there was enough food to feed the pharaohs and generals, the engineers and scribes, and the armies of people required to build the pyramids. The same is true of European civilization. From ancient times until the Renaissance, crops and animals of the Fertile Crescent fed the artists, inventors, and soldiers of Europe. In the 16th century, the same crops and animals were taken by Europeans to the New World. At the time, there was not a single cow or ear of wheat in all the Americas. Now there are 100 million cattle in the U.S. alone. And Americans consume 20 million tons of wheat a year. Modern, industrialized America would be unthinkable without the spread of farming from the Fertile Crescent. There are some who think Jared Diamond's argument is too neat and easy. Can the distribution of wealth and power really be reduced to cattle and wheat? What about culture, politics, and religion? Surely they've been just as important. Diamond's been criticized for being too deterministic, for ignoring the part people have played in shaping their own destiny.
My years in New Guinea have convinced me that people around the world are fundamentally similar. Wherever you go, you can find people who are smart, resourceful, and dynamic. No society has a monopoly on those traits. Of course, there are huge cultural differences, but they're mainly the result of inequality, they're not its root cause. Ultimately, what's far more important is the hand that people have been dealt, the raw materials they've had at their disposal. New Guineans acquired pigs from Eurasia, but not cows or sheep or goats or horses or wheat or barley. They didn't develop in the same way as Europeans and Americans because they didn't have the same raw materials. I'm not saying that those divisions of the world are set in stone and can't be changed. It's quite the opposite. The towns of Papua New Guinea are becoming bigger and more developed, populated by modern New Guineans trying to catch up with the rest of the world. Unfortunately for them, there's still a big gap to overcome.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
Yali caught me by surprise 30 years ago. I had no idea what to say to him then, but now I think I know the answer. Yali, it wasn't for lack of ingenuity that your people didn't end up with modern technology. They had the ingenuity to master these difficult New Guinea environments. Instead, the whole answer to your question was geography. If your people had enjoyed the same geographic advantages as my people, your people would have been the ones to invent helicopters.
Jared Diamond set out to explore the division of the world into haves and have-nots. He's convinced the blueprint for that division lies within the land itself. But can his way of seeing the world really shed light on the turning points of human history? Can it explain how a few hundred Europeans conquered the New World and began an age of domination? The age of guns, germs, and steel. One day in November, 1532, the New World and the Old World collided.
¿Cómo te atreves, indio perro?
168 Spaniards attacked the imperial army of the Incas in the highlands of Peru. Before the day was out, they had massacred 7,000 people and taken control of the Inca Emperor. Not a single Spanish life was lost in the process. Why was the balance of power so uneven between Old World and New? And why, in the centuries that followed, were Europeans the ones who conquered so much of the globe? These are questions that fascinate Professor Jared Diamond. He is on a quest to understand the roots of power, searching for clues in the most unlikely places. He's developed a highly original theory that what separates the winners from the losers is the land itself, geography. It was the shape of the continents, their crops and animals, that allowed some cultures to flourish, while others were left behind. But can this way of seeing the world shed light on the events of 1532? How can geography explain the conquest of the world by guns, germs, and steel? For 2 years, a band of Spanish conquistadors has been traveling in search of gold and glory. They're not professional soldiers, but mercenaries and adventurers, led by a retired army captain, Francisco Pizarro. He's already made a fortune for himself in the colonies of Central America. Now he's taking his men south into unknown territory. They are the first Europeans to have climbed the Andes and ventured this far into the continent of South America. As they travel, they find evidence of a large native civilization. They've reached the edge of the mighty Inca Empire. For Indians and Spaniards alike, any encounter is a clash of cultures. These Indians have never seen white men before and have no idea of the threat they represent. They can't imagine that within a few days, these strangers will turn their world upside down. By the 1530s, the Inca Empire was enormous. It stretched along the length of the Andes, from modern-day Ecuador to central Chile, a distance of 2,500 miles. But just 500 miles to the north began the colonies of Central America and the Caribbean, prized possessions of the Spanish Empire. At the time, the Spanish king controlled a third of mainland Europe, but Spain itself had only recently become a unified state, having fought off 700 years of occupation by Islamic Moors. It was still a rural society. Most of the conquistadors came from villages and small towns in the heart of the country. Towns like Trujillo, where Pizarro grew up. He spent much of his childhood here, working as a swineherd in the fields nearby. Today he's remembered as a great warrior. His statue dominates the main square in Trujillo. And his family home has been turned into a museum. Jared Diamond has come here to explore the world of the conquistadors and understand the secret of their success.
This is Francisco Pizarro, a Spaniard who conquered the most powerful state in the New World, the Inca Empire. Why did Pizarro and his men conquer the Incas instead of the other way around? Seems like a simple question. The answer isn't immediately obvious. After all, Pizarro started out as a rather ordinary person, and Trujillo here is a rather ordinary town. So what is it that gave Pizarro and his men this enormous power? Why am I so interested in Pizarro's conquistadors? Because their story is such a grimly successful example of European conquest. And for 30 years, I've been exploring patterns of conquest.
Jared Diamond is a professor at UCLA in Los Angeles. But most of his fieldwork has been done in Papua New Guinea. His time there inspired him to explore the roots of inequality in the modern world, to understand why some people have been able to dominate and conquer others. Looking back thousands of years, he argues that farming gave some cultures an enormous head start. And those who were lucky enough to have the most productive crops and animals became the most productive farmers. Agriculture first developed in a part of the Middle East known as the Fertile Crescent. Over time, crops and animals from the Fertile Crescent spread into North Africa and Europe, where they triggered an explosion of civilization. By the 16th century, European farms were dominated by livestock animals that had come from the Fertile Crescent. None were native to Europe. They provided more than just meat. They were a source of milk and wool, leather and manure. And crucially, they provided muscle power. Harnessed to a plow, a horse or an ox could transform the productivity of farmland. European farmers were able to grow more food to feed more people, who could then build bigger and more complex societies. In the New World, there were no horses or cattle for farming. All the work had to be done by hand. The only large domestic animal was the llama, but these docile creatures had never been harnessed to a plow. The Incas were very skilled at growing potatoes and corn, but because of their geography, they could never be as productive as European farmers. Horses gave Europeans another massive advantage. They could be ridden. To the Incas, the sight of Pizarro's conquistadors passing through their land is extraordinary. They've never seen people carried by their animals before. Some think they are gods, these strange-looking men, part human, part beast. The horses that seemed so exotic to the Incas had already been used in Spain for 4,000 years. In an age before motorized transport, they allowed people to be mobile and control their land.
Cambiar a la otra mano, haciendo una pirueta.
When Javier Martin is not herding cattle, he gives displays of traditional Spanish horsemanship.
Para que se arranquen ahí. Para que se vea.
This style of riding is known as jineta. The emphasis is on control and maneuverability, using bent knees to grip the sides of the horse and only one hand on the reins.
Para dejarlo a él más dentro.
Very different from the more formal style of medieval knights.
Ahora le voy a parar al lado de él.
By the 16th century, the jineta way of riding had become the dominant style of the Spanish cavalry. This is how the conquistadors would have ridden their horses.
Lo del acoso. Oh.
It's an amazing display of a big animal being controlled by a person, precise control, stopping and starting and turning. Javier told me that he has been riding since he was 5 years old, and when I watched this, I have a better understanding of where the conquistadors were coming from. They were masters of these techniques, and they learned these techniques for working with bulls, but the techniques were also good in a military context as well, and I can see that this control would let you ride down people in the open. People who had never seen horses before would have been absolutely terrified watching this. It would be strange and frightening, and that's even before one of these animals is rushing towards you, riding you down, about to lance you and kill you.
News of the godlike strangers on their four-legged animals is taken by royal messenger to the emperor of the Incas, who's camped in the valley of Cajamarca in northern Peru, guarded by an army of 80,000 men. Atahualpa is revered as a living god, a son of the sun itself. He's in Cajamarca on a religious retreat, giving thanks for a series of recent military triumphs. When he hears about the progress of the Spaniards, he chooses not to have them killed. Instead, he sends back a message. He invites them to join him in Cajamarca as quickly as possible.
Atahualpa wanted the Spaniards to come to Cajamarca and enter into a trap. And to be sure that they would do so, he played like a psychological game with them, sending presents, asking them to come. Atahualpa knew that the Spaniards were not gods. The intelligence reports speak of people wearing wool on their faces, like a llama, like an alpaca, that is like an animal. Then they went from one place to the other wearing on top of their heads a little pot that has never been used for cooking. You need to be crazy to walk with a pot, but you must be beyond salvation if you arrive to a camp and you don't use that pot to cook. Atahualpa had an idea that these were subhumans. What could a few horsemen and 100 and so Spaniards do to the powerful Inca? Virtually nothing.
But Atahualpa's spies don't realize that the Spanish are armed with some of the best weapons in the world. At the time of the conquistadors, Spain had the biggest army in Europe, orchestrated from the imperial capital, Toledo. For more than 700 years, the Spaniards had been at war, fighting against the Moors and other European armies. There was an arms race in Europe. To survive, the Spaniards needed to keep up with the latest in weapons technology.
Hey!
By the 1530s, the harquebus was an important part of the Spanish arsenal. Gunpowder had originally come from China, but its use as a weapon was pioneered by the Arabs. In European hands, guns became lighter and more portable, and were used for the first time by foot soldiers on the battlefield. The harquebus was still a crude weapon, but would go on to change the face of warfare.
To us, moderns, this gun doesn't seem useful for anything. It's like a joke. Its aim is terrible. It takes a long time to reload, and while the shooter's reloading, an assaultman would come in and kill him. But the Incas hadn't even gotten this far, and even this gun, with its sound and with the smell and with the smoke and with every now and then a person that it manages to kill, would have been terrifying to someone who had never seen this before. This would have been shock and awe, 1532 style.
For all its bluster, the technology of gunpowder was still in its infancy. The real power of the conquistadors lay elsewhere, with the production of steel. Toledo had some of the best swordsmiths in the world. But why were people here able to craft deadly steel weapons, while the Incas were still making simple bronze tools?
There was nothing innately brilliant about Europeans themselves that allowed them to be the ones to make high-quality swords. Just as with guns, swords were the result of a long process of trial and error that began outside Europe. People started working with metal in the Fertile Crescent 7,000 years ago. And because Europe was geographically close to the Fertile Crescent, Europeans inherited this metal technology. But they took this technology on to a new level. European soldiers demanded stronger, longer, sharper swords. This is what a Toledo sword looks like when it's finished. This particular one is modeled on the sword that Pizarro carried. It's a fearsome weapon. It's used for stabbing, and it's also used for slashing. And I can easily understand how the person wielding the sword could kill dozens of people within a short time.
Swords like this, rapiers, represented a high point in a very sophisticated metalworking technology. You think about what the qualities are that are needed in a sword. First of all, it has to be hard enough, the metal has to be hard enough to take a sharp edge. And that requires steel. That is iron infused with carbon. And the more carbon you put into the iron, then the harder the metal is. But if you make it too hard, then it's brittle. And that's no good, because as you hit somebody, your sword would break. And so you also need your sword to have a certain pliability, an ability to bend and spring back into shape. And it's got, by heating it to certain temperatures, plunging it into cold water, immense amount of experimentation. It took centuries to get to the level of sophistication where you could get something so long and elegant and fine and deadly as the rapier. The rapier, with its extra-long blade, was developed as a dueling weapon, but became so fashionable in Renaissance Europe, it was the sword of choice for any aspiring gentleman. The word rapier derives from the Spanish term espada ropera, and that means dress sword. And for the first time in Spain, we start to see people wearing the sword with their everyday clothing, their civilian dress, going about their everyday business. They didn't do that in the Middle Ages. This is something new in the 16th century. And it's saying, I have arrived, I am a gentleman, I am upwardly mobile, and I claim ancestry from the knights of the Middle Ages. It was very much a symbol of the conquistadors' aspiring greed. The thing that drove them through all their hardships, the thing that made them go to the Americas, was their lust for gold, their lust for self-advancement. And the rapier absolutely symbolized that overbearing avarice. On November 15, 1532, Pizarro's band of adventurers enters the valley of Cajamarca. They've been told that Atahualpa is waiting for them here, but they're not prepared for the sight that greets them. In the hills beyond the town of Cajamarca is the Imperial Inca army, 80,000 men in full battle order. The conquistadors' own journals bear witness to their first impressions.
Their camp looked like a very beautiful city. We'd seen nothing like it in the Indies until then, and it scared us, because we were so few and so deep in this land.
Pizarro sends a party of his best horsemen into the heart of the Inca camp. They are led by Captain de Soto. They are gambling that Atahualpa will allow them to pass through the camp unharmed, and agree to meet them.
Soto's visit had a very important psychological purpose: to intimidate the Inca in front of his people, challenging him with the horse. Atahualpa at first didn't react to Soto's presence, as if nobody had entered the room. Once the horse comes eye to eye with the Inca is still calm, showing that the horse has no impact on him, calling Soto's bluff.
The captain advanced so close that the horse's nostrils disturbed the fringe on the Inca's forehead. But the Inca never moved.
And then, after a brief silence, comes Atahualpa's explosion. He was telling them, the time has come for you to pay. I understand this as the time has come for you to pay with your lives.
Pakaring, umalyak ni kichiswang tupasak. Umalyak ni kichiswang.
Soto, I understand, was nervous enough to come back with fear to the camp. And as we know, the Spaniards spent the night before in extreme fear.
The conquistadors have made their camp in the town of Cajamarca. Many of them are now convinced they are facing oblivion. 168 soldiers, 1,000 miles from any other Spaniard, facing an army of 80,000 Incas.
Few of us slept that night. We kept watch in the square, from where we could see the campfires of the Indian army. It was a fearful sight, like a brilliantly star-studded night.
Pizarro and his most trusted officers debate their options for how to deal with Atahualpa. Some advise caution, but Pizarro insists their best chance is to launch a surprise attack the next day. It's a tactic that's worked successfully in the past. 12 years before Pizarro went to Peru, another famous conquistador, Hernán Cortés, had gone to Mexico and encountered another formidable civilization, the Aztecs. He conquered the country by kidnapping the Aztec leader and exploiting the ensuing chaos. Cortés's story was later published and became a bestseller, a handbook for any would-be conquistador. It can still be found in the great library of Salamanca University in northern Spain.
This wonderful library here can be thought of, among other things, as a repository of dirty tricks, because in these books are the accounts of what generals had been doing to other generals for thousands of years in the past and across much of Eurasia. And here from this library we have a famous account of the conquest of Mexico with all the details of what Cortés did to the Aztecs and what worked. That was a model for Pizarro to give him ideas what exactly to try out on the Incas, whereas the Incas, without writing, had only local knowledge transmitted by oral memory, and they were unsophisticated and naive compared to the Spaniards because of writing.
But if books were so useful, why couldn't the Incas read or write? To develop a new system of writing independently is an extremely complex process, and has happened very rarely in human history. It was first achieved by the Sumerian people of the Fertile Crescent at least 5,000 years ago. They pioneered an elaborate system of symbols called cuneiform, possibly as a way of recording farming transactions. Ever since, almost every other written language of Europe and Asia has copied, adapted, or simply been inspired by the basics of cuneiform. The spread of writing was helped enormously by the invention of paper, ink, and movable type. Innovations that all came from outside Europe, but were seized upon by Europeans in the Middle Ages to produce the ultimate transmitter of knowledge, the printing press. The written word could now spread quickly and accurately across Europe and Asia. The modern world would be impossible without the development of writing. But there's another part of the world where a new system of writing was invented independently. In southern Mexico, at least 2,500 years ago, native people developed a way of working with symbols that evolved into the Mayan script. But if the Maya had writing, why didn't it spread south to the Andes and help the Incas become literate? For Diamond, the answer lies in the shape of the continents.
Here are Europe and Asia forming the continent of Eurasia, a giant continent, but it's stretched out from east to west and narrow from north to south. The American continent is long from north to south, narrow from east to west, very narrow at Panama, where it narrows down to less than 100 miles. The two continents are of the same lengths, about 8,000 miles in maximum dimensions, but Eurasia is 8,000 miles from east to west, and the Americas are 8,000 miles from north to south. It's as if these continents were rotated 90 degrees of each other.
Diamond has already shown that crops and animals could spread easily east and west across Eurasia. Because places at the same latitude automatically share the same day length and a similar climate and vegetation. But the American continents were the opposite of Eurasia. A journey from one end of the Americas to the other is a journey from north to south. A journey through different day lengths, different climate zones, and dramatically different vegetation. These basic differences hindered the spread of crops and animals, as well as people, ideas, and technologies. The people of the Andes were chronically isolated, without access to writing or almost any other innovation from elsewhere in the Americas. By contrast, Pizarro and his men were geographically blessed. As Spaniards, they enjoyed the benefit of technologies and ideas that had spread easily across Eurasia.
The events of 1532 were clearly influenced by deep causes, over which no individual Spaniard or Inca had any control. The shape of the continents, the distribution of plants and animals, the spread of Eurasian technology. These were facts of geography. And at almost every turn of the drama, geography was tilted in favor of Europeans.
It's the morning of November 16th, 1532. Atahualpa has agreed to meet the Spaniards in the town of Cajamarca and sends his entourage ahead of him. But he makes a fateful decision, that his soldiers should not carry weapons.
The Indians were musicians and dancers. They were soldiers, but unarmed. Why would Atahualpa unarm his own soldiers? Why? Because he was in a festivity. He was celebrating. He wasn't going to war. He was going for a celebration so that the whole people could see how the alleged gods would run away in fear. The fact that some people believed that the Spaniards were gods would play better in the hands of Atahualpa's purpose. If I know they are not gods and I defeat the gods, then of course everybody will be with me. But what if I defeat the gods with no show of force at all? Then I am beyond the gods.
While Atahualpa and his men enter Cajamarca, the Spaniards are waiting, hidden from view.
There were 5,000 or 6,000 men, and behind them the figure of Atahualpa seated on a very fine litter, lined with feathers and embellished with gold and silver. Many of us pissed ourselves out of sheer terror.
The square is filled with Atahualpa's people, but there's not one Spaniard outside. Atahualpa asks, "Where are these dogs?" One of his right hands answers, "They have run away because they are afraid of the magnificent Inca." Of course, the whole crowd listened to this and believed that this was the case.
Me presento ante vosotros en nombre de la cristiandad.
Pizarro sends out his priest to confront Atahualpa.
Para enseñaros el camino de la verdad.
The conquistadors are obliged to try and convert native people before any resort to violence.
Pinkanki sunkasapa. Mokakakani intech churingmi. Mokankani intitaitach churing. Manang imaparruanay kichu kay peja.
Mi poder procede de mi Señor. Sus palabras están escritas en este libro.
Imankaipi.
Atahualpa has never seen a book before. He doesn't know what to do with it.
Imankay. Manang imapaschu kayka. Manang rimas kayki kay picanchu.
¿Cómo te atreves, indio perro? ¡Salgan, españoles! ¡Destruyen a estos perros que no respetan las cosas de Dios! ¡Santiago, a ellos!
At that moment, with the crowd absolutely unprepared, the horses come. There was massive panic.
Just imagine the scene in Cajamarca. The Incas hadn't seen horses before, and these aren't ordinary horses, these are Spanish horses. Fierce, big, fighting horses. They could get in amongst men, they would trample men, and they made the most excellent platform. From a horse, you could stab down to the left, stab down to the right. You could cut, you could scythe, hacking all about you. If only the Incas had known that what you had to do against cavalry was stand firm, then they'd have been all right. They had superior numbers, but they didn't know that. They fled, they broke ranks, and then the horsemen could get in amongst them, and they cut them down. There was an Inca god called Viracocha, and he was a white man, and he was the god of thunder. And they thought these men with their arquebuses were the very incarnation of Viracocha.
The Inca force was in his litter, helped by his carriers. As soon as they were able to do it, the Spaniards went after the litter. And they started killing the carriers. One carrier would fall, and another one would replace him. Only at the very, very, very end of the tragedy, the litter started to move because there were no more carriers left.
As the litter falls, Pizarro himself captures Atahualpa. His plan has worked to perfection. Atahualpa is taken to a makeshift prison in the royal quarters at Cajamarca.
He thought we were going to kill him, but we told him no. Christians only kill in the heat of the battle.
Outside, thousands of Incas are dead. The rest of the army has retreated to the hills. In spite of a massive imbalance in numbers, Spanish horses, swords, and strategy have proved decisive. But the Spaniards possessed another weapon they didn't even know they had. A weapon of mass destruction that had marched invisibly ahead of them. Today, the war against infectious disease is waged at biological research centers like Porton Down in southern England. They produce vaccines here against the world's deadliest viruses. In the 16th century, there were no vaccines, and there was no protection from the rampant spread of infectious disease. "12 years before Pizarro arrived at Cajamarca, a Spanish ship sailed to Mexico. On board, one of the slaves was suffering from the first signs of a fever. He was the first person to bring a deadly disease to the American mainland. The disease was smallpox. Within weeks, the smallpox virus would spread from a single source to infect thousands of Native Americans.
Smallpox gets into the body when you breathe in the particles, and they attach themselves to the back of your throat and the inside of your lungs. About 2 to 3 days into the illness, then the classic rash appears. And in its worst forms, this takes over the whole of the body with initially pimples and then enormous blisters until the whole of the skin, starting with the hands and the face and then spreading down to cover the rest of the body, is taken over by the smallpox blisters. From that time on, the patient is highly infectious. Because each of those blisters is packed full of smallpox particles, then if you burst the blister, the fluid will come out and large numbers of viruses will be spilled onto whatever it touches. "10 to 12 days later, his friends would begin to be taken ill, and then 10 to 12 days after that, their friends. That kind of rate means the disease spreads exponentially. Its rate of increase gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more people are infected, until eventually it will cause tremendous devastation in the population.
The first smallpox epidemic of the New World swept through Central America and reached the Inca Empire. Wherever it went, the virus decimated native populations, making them easier prey for Spanish conquest. But why were the germs so one-sided? Why did the Spaniards pass their diseases onto the Incas and not the other way around?
This is Pizarro's secret weapon. Pigs and cows, sheep and goats, domestic animals. Remember that Pizarro was a swineherd. He grew up in huts like this, in intimate contact with domestic animals, breathing in their germs, drinking the germs in their milk, and it was from the germs of domestic animals that the killer diseases of humans evolved. For example, our flu evolved from a disease of pigs transmitted via chickens and ducks. We acquired measles from cattle. We acquired smallpox from domestic animals, so that these worst killers of human people were a legacy of 10,000 years of contact with our beloved domestic animals.
During the Middle Ages, infectious diseases swept through Europe and claimed millions of lives. But paradoxically, repeated epidemics made Europeans more resilient. In each outbreak, there were always some people who were genetically better able to fight off the virus. These people were more likely to survive and have children. In the process, they'd pass on their genetic resistance. Over centuries, whole populations acquired some degree of protection against the spread of diseases like smallpox, a protection the Incas never had.
When smallpox was taken to the New World, nobody in the New World had ever seen a disease like this before, so the number of people who were susceptible was much greater. There was no natural immunity, and so therefore the number of people who could both contract the disease and then spread it, and the number of people to receive it once it had been spread, was much higher. More people would die, and more people would be susceptible to catch it in the first place. It would spread rapidly throughout the population, and the death toll would be enormous.
Why hadn't Native Americans encountered smallpox before? And why didn't they have any deadly diseases of their own to pass on to the Spaniards? It's simply because they didn't have the same history of contact with farm animals. The Incas had llamas, but llamas aren't like European cows and sheep. They're not milked, they're not kept in large herds, and they don't live in barns and huts alongside humans. There was no significant exchange of germs between llamas and people.
The key to Diamond's argument is the distribution of farm animals around the world. Aside from the llama, all the large farm animals were native to Eurasia and North Africa. None was ever domesticated in North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Australia. As a result, the worst epidemic diseases were also native to Eurasia and North Africa, and were then spread around the world with deadly effect. There's been a long debate about the number of indigenous people who died in the Spanish conquest of the New World. Some scholars think there may have been a population of 20 million Native Americans, and the vast majority, perhaps 95%, were killed by Old World diseases. A continent virtually emptied of its people. After the initial shock of his capture, Atahualpa became a cooperative prisoner. He learned to speak Spanish and play chess with his captors. The Spaniards realized he was more useful to them alive than dead. He was allowed to re-establish his court and prison, as long as he ordered his people to accept Spanish rule. He also ordered them to melt down a vast amount of treasure. Pizarro had promised Atahualpa his freedom in return for the gold. It proved to be an empty promise. Having handed over 20 tons of gold and silver, Atahualpa was no longer useful to his captors.
Infinita misericordia, en el último instante, le tendió una mano y lo llevó al reino de los cielos. Ahora, recemos por su alma.
He was garroted to death in the same square where so many of his followers had been slaughtered 8 months earlier. With Atahualpa dead, the conquistadors went on to colonize the rest of Peru, relying on the power of their guns, germs, and steel. Gold from the Spanish colonies was brought back to Seville in southern Spain. There's little activity on the Guadalquivir River today, but in the 16th century, this was among the most important, busiest ports in the world. The steady flow of ships carrying treasure from the Americas helped Spain become one of the richest nations on earth. The conquistadors had changed forever the relationship between Old World and New.
I came to Spain to answer a question. Why did Pizarro and his men conquer the Incas instead of the other way around? There's a whole mythology that conquest and the European expansion in general resulted from Europeans themselves being especially brave or bold or inventive or smart. But the answers turn out to have nothing to do with any personal qualities of Europeans. Yeah, Pizarro and his men were brave, but there were plenty of brave Incas. Instead, Europeans were accidental conquerors. By virtue of their geographic location in history, they were the first people to acquire guns, germs, and steel.
By the end of the 19th century, European powers had ventured beyond the Americas and colonized Africa, Australia, and much of Asia. The process that began at Cajamarca had reached its logical conclusion. European guns, germs, and steel were reshaping the world.